The first time she let herself in without knocking, I pretended not to notice, though the sound of the key twisting in the lock startled me like a gunshot in the quiet of my house, the place where I had grown used to silence after Ellen left for work and the grandkids only visited on holidays, and there she was, Maricela, balancing a grocery bag against her hip, dark braids slipping forward over her shoulder, telling me she picked up milk because she saw we were out, as if she lived here, as if she had always belonged to the rhythm of these walls. And I remember standing there barefoot on the kitchen tile wondering when exactly the maid I hired 3 months earlier had become someone who anticipated my needs better than my own wife. And I said nothing, just nodded, letting her set the bag down, breathing in the faint smell of detergent clinging to her uniform, the sweetness of oranges rising from the bag. And when she smiled at me, it was not the polite grin of an employee but something slower, stretched, a smile that waited for me to either accept or resist, and I accepted. Though not with words, only with the way I stayed standing too close as she brushed past. Shoulder grazing chest, a tiny spark too sharp for a man of 65 to ignore. Or maybe exactly sharp enough because I had started to believe nothing new could ever pierce me again, yet here she was, with a copy of the keys I had given her out of convenience. A trust that was supposed to be about trash days and vacuuming. And instead each turn of metal in the lock became an opening, a permission. A widening crack in the life I had sworn was steady. And that afternoon as I watched her wipe the counter, humming some song in Spanish I couldn't translate but could feel in the back of my throat, I realized that I had already stepped across something. Some invisible line drawn years ago by vows and routines. And stepping back would mean admitting that the silence before her was easier than the sound of that key, which it wasn't, not anymore. The day she began leaving notes was the day I stopped pretending this was still a clean arrangement, because folded under the salt shaker I found a scrap of receipt paper in her handwriting, looping and careful, saying simply, "You look tired today, rest." And my hand trembled holding it as if it were contraband. Something Ellen might find, though Ellen never noticed the kitchen details anymore. And I tucked it into my pocket instead of the trash, carrying it around like a secret pulse, feeling it heat against my thigh all afternoon while I raked the yard. Until at dusk she returned, key turning, light spilling across the floor. And I felt like a boy caught waiting, though she only dropped off a container of soup with no explanation except the same slow smile. And I didn't tell her I had kept the note. Didn't tell her that I read it 3 times before bed, whispering it in the dark like a prayer. But she must have known, because the next morning another slip appeared inside the silverware drawer, this one reading "Don't forget yourself," and I felt something twist in me. Shame and hunger all at once, and I began listening for that lock every hour. The metallic click that meant she was choosing to enter not just my house but my solitude. And Ellen asked once why the fridge seemed always stocked, why the laundry was folded differently, and I lied without even pausing. Said I'd been more careful lately, said retirement gave me time, and I watched my wife nod, distracted, while across the table her phone buzzed with work emails. And in that space Maricela's notes lived brighter than conversation. Brighter than the television, little fragments of intimacy pressed between teaspoons and bread bags, and the more I kept them, lining them in my desk drawer like pressed flowers, the more I felt the house belonged less to Ellen and me and more to this woman who carried both groceries and something heavier through the door with her borrowed key, leaving me restless, guilty, and alive in a way I hadn't expected to ever feel again. One afternoon I came back from the pharmacy to find her sitting at my dining table. Not cleaning, not folding, but sitting there with a notebook open, pen poised. As though the house belonged to her and she had simply paused mid-thought. And she didn't scramble up the way an employee would, she only looked at me, eyes steady, and said, "I hope you don't mind, it's quieter here than my apartment," and I should have minded. I should have reminded her of boundaries. But instead I found myself setting my bag down and pouring us both iced tea. As if this had been arranged, and we sat together while she wrote and I pretended to read the paper, stealing glances at the way her hand moved across the page, slow, deliberate, as if each word cost her something. And when she finally pushed the notebook toward me, I saw lines in Spanish mixed with English. Half poems, half confessions, and she said, "You don't need to understand all of it. Just feel it," so I did, and I felt it in my chest, in my hands, in the silence stretching between us. And before I could think, I reached out and touched her wrist, light, barely a press, but enough to shift the air, enough to make her breath catch, and she didn't pull away. She only turned her palm upward, fingers brushing mine. And it was more electric than any kiss could have been, more dangerous because it was quiet, unspoken, and I remember hearing the faint rattle of Ellen's keyring in my memory. Realizing if she walked in right, then I would be exposed in a way I hadn't been since youth. But Ellen wasn't there. Ellen never came home early anymore, and so Maricela stayed, writing, sipping tea, her arm resting close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating. And when she left that evening, she didn't take the notebook, only tucked another note under my glass that read, "It feels different here with you." And I sat there long after the sun set, staring at those words, understanding that the line I thought I'd crossed weeks ago had only been the first. And the real crossing was still ahead, waiting, inevitable. With every turn of her key in my lock. It was raining the first time she stayed past dark. The kind of Texas storm that rattled the windows and blurred the streetlights into watery halos, and I offered her a towel when she came in soaked from the grocery run I hadn't asked her to make, her hair clinging wet to her face, shirt plastered to her skin. And instead of retreating to her usual tasks, she stood in the kitchen doorway, dripping on the floor, smiling at me as though daring me to say something. And I couldn't find words, only handed her an old sweatshirt from the hall closet. One Ellen's brother had left years ago, and she pulled it over her head right there, unbothered by my staring, and when she laughed at how it swallowed her frame, the sound cracked. Something open in me, louder than the thunder outside. And we sat at the table listening to the rain hammer the roof. Steam rising from the mugs of coffee she insisted on brewing, though it was already evening. And the house felt strangely alive, shadows dancing, silence charged. And at one point her hand rested on the table between us, palm up, not reaching, just waiting. And I set mine over it before my mind could catch up. And the world narrowed to that single touch, her damp skin warm against my old, veined hand. And I thought about Ellen out there somewhere, at a late meeting or maybe another hotel night she didn't explain. And guilt surged sharp in my gut but didn't move me to pull away, because in that storm, in that kitchen, the only truth was Maricela's hand, and when the power flickered and went out, plunging the room into candlelight glow, she didn't move her hand, didn't laugh, didn't speak. Only looked at me through the dark as if she had been waiting for this collapse of boundaries all along, and when finally she rose to leave, she lingered at the door. Sweatshirt hood pulled tight, saying softly, "You don't have to be alone when it rains." And then the key turned again, and the sound of it felt less like intrusion and more like invitation, like the beginning of something I was no longer strong enough to resist. The morning after that storm, I found her sweatshirt folded on the chair as if she wanted to remind me she had been there, and all day I carried the weight of it in my chest. The soft fabric like evidence of a crime no one had accused me of yet. And when she arrived again, she didn't knock, didn't call out. Just slipped inside and moved through the house as though she had memorized its rhythm. Humming low, and I watched from the living room doorway. Watched the way she bent to pick up the stray socks I'd left by the recliner. The way her braid brushed her back like a metronome. And the thought struck me that she knew more about my daily life now than Ellen ever did. Every small mess, every medicine bottle on the counter. Every restless night shown by the unmade sheets. And I should have felt exposed, but instead it felt like being seen, really seen. And when she caught me watching, she didn't look away, only said, "You don't have to hide from me." And something in the way she said it, soft but steady, made my throat close. Because I hadn't realized until then how much hiding I had been doing, years of quiet meals. Careful silences, pretending satisfaction. And suddenly here was this woman who held my secrets not in judgment but in her hands as casually as she held my laundry. And when she crossed the room and placed her palm against my cheek, it was so natural, so inevitable, that I didn't even flinch, only leaned into the warmth. The smell of soap and rain still clinging to her, and when her lips brushed mine, tentative at first then firmer, I felt the floor tilt, the house shift. The vows I had kept like furniture gathering dust collapsing in that single press of mouths. And afterward we didn't speak, didn't need to, because the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full, charged, and when she finally left, she didn't take the sweatshirt. Didn't leave a note, only touched the key in the lock slowly, deliberately. As if reminding me that from now on every turn of it would mean more than just entering. It would mean belonging, and I stood there in the half-light knowing I had crossed not just a line but a threshold, one I could never uncross.